All right, so imagine your electricity bill jumps up 25%, like overnight. Not fun, right?
No, not at all.
Well, that's what's happening to like 1.5 million Americans in Minnesota, New York, and Michigan, thanks to a trade war that's gotten really, really heated.
Yeah, it shows how connected everything is, right? Our economies, even with our closest neighbors.
Right.
And in this deep dive, we're going to unpack how Ontario, Canada is using electricity like as a weapon in this high-stakes battle.
Interesting.
Angry governors, patriotic Canadians, even Elon Musk's SpaceX is caught in the crossfire.
Hold on, SpaceX. Okay, you've got my attention now. So how did we even get to this point where electricity is like a bargaining chip?
Well, it all started with President Trump slapping tariffs on a bunch of Canadian goods and energy, 25% on goods and 10% on energy, to be exact.
Ouch, that's got to sting. So how did Canada and specifically Ontario respond to that?
Well, Ontario Premier Dougford, he decided to fight fire with fire, hit back with a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to those 3 U.S. states. And he didn't mince words. He said, quote, "You touch the stove once you get burned, you don't touch that stove again."
That's pretty clear message.
Yeah.
But I find it interesting that he's pulling this move while still claiming to have like a phenomenal relationship with the governors of those states.
It is kind of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
They might be buddies on a personal level, but when it comes to protecting their economies and voters, it's a whole different ballgame.
Definitely. So what's the fallout been like on the U.S. side? Are those governors just taking this lying down?
Not exactly.
Hmm.
Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, a Democrat, has been very vocal in his criticism of Trump's tariffs and the economic impact they're having.
Makes sense. But what about Republicans? I imagine they'd be more supportive of like Trump's policies.
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Sources say even some Republicans are privately fuming about this. They're worried about the economic consequences for businesses and consumers in their states.
So why aren't they speaking out like publicly?
It's tricky. They're caught between party loyalty and representing the best interests of their voters. And let's be real openly, criticizing your own party's president can be political suicide.
Yeah, I can see that. But beyond the political drama, what are the real-world effects of all this?
Well, Minnesota's a prime example. They're dealing with higher energy costs, which are also messing with their supply chains, making it harder for their businesses to compete. And this isn't just some abstract economic theory. It has real-world consequences for people's lives, their livelihoods.
Right. That's what Ford was getting at when he mentioned potential job losses and the impact on pension funds, right?
Exactly. And this tit for tat between Canada and the U.S., it's escalated even further. Canada retaliated with tariffs on $30 billion worth of American products and had another $125 billion in tariffs lined up. Then Trump gave a temporary break on some auto-related imports, and potash led Canada to hold off on that second wave of tariffs. It's like a high-stakes game of economic chicken.
So where do things stand now? Is there any end in sight to this tariff war?
Both Ford and Prime Minister Trudeau have made it clear they won't back down until all tariffs are removed. And Ford seems particularly dug in, saying he thinks Trump underestimated Canada's resolve, and the wave of patriotism sweeping the nation, it's become a matter of principle for them.
So it sounds like Canada's ready to play hardball. What other moves has Ford made?
Well, he's threatened to completely cut off power to those 3 U.S. states if the tariffs stay in place.
Whoa, that would be a huge escalation. What would that even look like on the ground?
It'd be chaos. Imagine businesses shutting down hospitals, scrambling for backup power, people's lives getting disrupted. It's a powerful card for Ontario to hold. Being a major electricity supplier to those states shows how serious they are about this fight.
So it's not just talk. Ford's actually willing to pull the plug if he has to.
He is, but it's a risky move. While it might force the U.S. to negotiate it, could also backfire and cause long-term damage to the relationship between the two countries.
Okay, so cutting off the power is a big one. What else is in Ford's arsenal?
He's floated the idea of stockpiling nickel, which is a crucial ingredient for the U.S. military and aerospace industry you're talking about, hitting them where it really hurts.
Wait, nickel. Why is that so important?
Nickel is a key component in things like jet engines, missiles, even some types of armor. It's a super strong, heat-resistant metal that's essential for a lot of high-tech military applications.
So by controlling the nickel supply, Canada could actually hamper the U.S. military.
Exactly. It's a classic power play in trade wars. Controlling access to key resources gives you leverage, and in this case, it highlights just how much the U.S. relies on Canada for certain strategic materials.
Wow, I had no idea nickel was such a big deal. What other retaliatory moves has Ford taken?
Well, he canceled a $100 million deal with SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, to bring high-speed internet to underserved communities in Ontario. Seems even SpaceX isn't immune to the fallout of this trade war.
SpaceX, that's a pretty big name to be caught in the crosshairs. What does this say about the broader impact of this whole situation?
It shows just how interconnected the global economy really is. Decisions made in one sector can have ripple effects across seemingly unrelated industries. This trade war is like a spider web, and once you get caught in it, it's hard to get free.
So it's not just about electricity and tariffs anymore. It's starting to affect things like internet access and space exploration.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. Ford has also banned U.S. companies from bidding on Ontario's $30 billion worth of procurement contracts.
Whoa, so he's basically shutting U.S. businesses out of a huge chunk of the Ontario market.
He is. And to add insult to injury, he's even told the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, which is where Ontarians get their booze, to stop selling American products.
He's taking this fight to the liquor store. This is getting serious. So what does it all mean? Why is Ford taking such a strong stance, even going as far as messing with people's happy hour?
It's a calculated risk. He's trying to demonstrate that Canada and Ontario specifically won't be bullied by the U.S. It's a message that resonates with a lot of Canadians who are feeling a surge of patriotism right now.
So this is about more than just economics. It's about national pride and standing up for what they believe in.
Absolutely. And it raises a really important question. Is this just a temporary spat, or could this dispute lead to a more permanent shift in the relationship between Canada and the U.S., particularly when it comes to things like energy?
That's a big question, and one we'll need to explore further as this situation unfolds. But before we go any deeper, let's take a step back and make sure we're all on the same page about the U.S.-Canada trade relationship.
Good point. It's easy to get lost in the details, but understanding the bigger picture is crucial here. So let's rewind a bit and look at the history of trade between these two countries and how we ended up in this situation. Well, the U.S. and Canada have long been close trading partners. In fact, Canada is the U.S.'s largest goods trading partner.
Oh, wow.
And the trade relationship between the two countries is worth hundreds of billions of dollars every year.
So this isn't just some minor squabble. This is a dispute between two economic heavyweights. What are some of the key goods and services that are traded between the two countries?
It's a pretty diverse mix. The U.S. relies heavily on Canada for things like oil, natural gas, lumber, minerals.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Canada imports a lot of manufactured goods, technology, agricultural products from the U.S.
So there's a lot of interdependence there.
Yeah.
What triggered this current wave of tension and tariffs?
The seeds of this trade war were actually sown a few years ago when the Trump administration started imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from several countries, including Canada.
Right.
The U.S. argued it was a matter of national security, but Canada saw it as protectionist and harmful to their economy.
And Canada didn't just sit back and take it, right?
No, they retaliated with their own tariffs on a range of U.S. products, from ketchup to bourbon.
Oh, wow.
And that set off a cycle of tit-for-tat measures that have escalated over time.
So this current dispute over electricity and nickel is really just the latest chapter in a longer-running saga.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that trade disputes aren't just about economics. They often become entangled with politics and national pride.
That makes sense. So with this broader context in mind, do you think Ford's aggressive stance is actually the right move for Canada in the long run?
That's a tough question. On one hand, his tough talk and retaliatory measures have rallied a lot of Canadians and sent a clear message to the U.S. that they won't be pushed around.
Yeah, he's definitely playing to that sense of Canadian patriotism we talked about earlier.
He is, but on the other hand, some experts worry that his actions could backfire and damage the long-term economic relationship between the two countries.
So it's a gamble. He's betting that the U.S. will blink first and back down on the tariffs. But there's a risk that this could escalate even further and hurt everyone involved.
Precisely. And it's not just the governments and big businesses that are feeling the pain, as we discussed earlier. Consumers on both sides of the border are facing higher prices and limited choices due to these tariffs.
Right. It's a reminder that these trade wars have real-world consequences for everyday people. And what about the impact on those U.S. states that rely on Ontario for electricity? What are they saying about all this?
Well, as you can imagine, they're not too happy about it. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. They rely on that Canadian electricity to keep their lights on and businesses running. But they're also feeling the pressure from the federal government to support the tariffs.
So they're kind of collateral damage in this bigger fight. Are they doing anything to try and influence the situation?
Some of the affected governors have reached out to the White House, urging them to reconsider the tariffs and find a way to de-escalate the situation. But so far, their pleas seem to be falling on deaf ears.
So it's a stalemate. Canada won't budge until the tariffs are lifted, and the U.S. seems determined to hold firm. What are the possible scenarios that could play out from here?
Well, one possibility is that the U.S. eventually caves to the pressure and removes the tariffs. This could happen if the economic and political costs become too high, or if they manage to secure some concessions from Canada and other areas.
So that would be a win for Canada. And for those U.S. states that are feeling the squeeze, what other outcomes are possible?
Another scenario is that this dispute drags on for months or even years, with both sides digging in their heels and refusing to compromise. This would be a lose-lose situation, leading to prolonged economic uncertainty and strained relations between the two countries.
That sounds pretty bleak. Is there any chance that this could escalate even further beyond just tariffs and trade restrictions?
It's not impossible. Some analysts worry that this could spill over into other areas of cooperation, such as security or environmental policy. And as we've seen with the nickel situation, it could even impact military preparedness.
So the stakes are pretty high. What about the possibility of a more permanent shift in the energy relationship between Canada and the U.S.? Is that a realistic outcome?
It's certainly a possibility if this dispute drags on and trust continues to erode. It could lead both countries to seek out alternative energy partners.
So Canada might start selling more of its electricity to other countries, and the U.S. might look to other sources for its energy needs.
Exactly, and that would have significant implications for the energy landscape in North America and beyond.
It sounds like this situation is a real turning point. It's forcing both countries to rethink their relationship and their reliance on each other.
It is, and it's a reminder that in today's interconnected world, even seemingly isolated trade disputes can have far-reaching consequences.
So what are some of those broader implications? What does this situation tell us about the future of global trade and international relations?
Well, it's a stark reminder that we're living in an era of rising protectionism and economic nationalism. Countries are increasingly looking inward, prioritizing their own interests over global cooperation.
We're seeing this play out in other parts of the world as well, right?
Absolutely. Trade tensions between the U.S. and China have been simmering for years, and the U.K.'s exit from the European Union has also created a lot of uncertainty and disruption.
So this trend of countries turning inward is not just a North American phenomenon, it's a global one.
It is, and it's something we need to pay close attention to because it has the potential to reshape the global economic order.
That's a pretty sobering thought. But before we get too carried away with the doom and gloom, let's bring this back to our listeners. What can they do to stay informed and navigate this increasingly complex world?
That's a great question. I think it's more important than ever to stay curious, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to be critical consumers of information.
That's such a valuable piece of advice. And with that in mind, let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the resources and tools that our listeners can use to stay ahead of the curve and make sense of all this. So where can our listeners go to get reliable information about trade tariffs and the global economy? It's a lot to keep up with.
It really is. There are a lot of voices out there, but not all of them are equally trustworthy. I'd recommend sticking to reputable news sources like The Economist, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal.
Okay.
They have teams of experts who analyze these issues in depth and provide balanced reporting.
Those are great resources, but they can be a bit dense sometimes.
Yeah.
Are there any websites or podcasts that break down these complex topics in a more accessible way?
Absolutely. For a more digestible take on global economics, I recommend checking out Planet Money from NPR. They do a fantastic job of explaining complex economic concepts using storytelling and humor. And for a Canadian perspective, the CBC's Front Burner podcast is a great option. They often cover Canadian trade issues and how they're affecting people on the ground.
Perfect. So we've got options for both the serious policy wonks and those who prefer a more casual approach. And remember, it's important to be aware of your own biases and to seek out information from a variety of sources.
So important. It's easy to get caught in an echo chamber, especially online. Challenge yourself to read and listen to viewpoints that you might not initially agree with. It's the best way to develop a well-rounded understanding of any issue.
Right. It's all about getting that 360-degree view. Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on something we haven't discussed yet, the human side of this story. We've talked a lot about the economics and the politics, but what about the people whose lives are being directly impacted by these tariffs and trade wars?
That's a crucial point behind all the statistics and policy debates. There are real people whose jobs, businesses, and communities are being affected. Think about the workers in the steel and aluminum industries, the farmers who are struggling to export their crops, the small business owners who are facing higher costs for imported goods. These are the faces of this trade war.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about the human impact when we're talking about abstract concepts like tariffs and trade deficits, but It's important to remember that these decisions have real-world consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. And it's not just about economic hardship, it's also about the social and psychological effects of these trade disputes.
Yeah.
The uncertainty, the fear of job losses, the stress on families, these things take a toll.
It's a reminder that trade is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people's lives, their hopes and their dreams.
Well said. And as the situation unfolds, I think it's crucial for us to keep those human stories in mind.
I agree. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. This trade war between Canada and the U.S. is a complex issue with no easy answers. But one thing is clear. The outcome will have a profound impact on both countries and on the future of their relationship.
And it's not just about Canada and the U.S. This dispute is a microcosm of the larger trends shaping the global economy. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected and that the choices we make as individuals, as businesses, and as nations have ripple effects that extend far beyond our borders.
So as you go about your day, consider the products you buy, the companies you support, and the policies you advocate for your choices matter. And they have the power to shape the world we live in. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration of the forces shaping our world.